A struggling single dad boarded a billionaire's yacht with nothing but worn tools and pride. He expected only work, until the heiress's son leaned close, whispering a request so simple it would change all their lives forever. The harbor woke slowly, the air heavy with brine and the faint cry of gulls. Dawn stretched its pale fingers across the water, gilding the ripples with light that made even the rusting hulls seem briefly regal. On the far dock, Daniel Mercer crouched over an engine block, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. His hands, broad and calloused, worked with quiet precision, coaxing life into machinery that most others would have condemned. He wore the same flannel shirt he had patched twice already, the fabric soft with years of use, and his boots were scuffed from seasons of salt and oil. To anyone passing, he looked like a man stitched together by labor and loss, carrying a resilience that had no room for polish. A few yards away, his daughter Lila sat cross-legged on the boards, a notebook propped against her knees. She sketched the lines of a schooner she had watched sail past the day before, her pencil tracing curves with surprising steadiness. Every so often she would glance up, her sharp blue eyes catching the way her father's wrench slipped over a bolt or the angle at which he adjusted a gear. She never interrupted, but sometimes she murmured softly to herself, naming parts the way another child might recite verses. It was her quiet ritual, absorbing his world without ever being asked to lift a tool. Daniel's life had narrowed to this rhythm since the accident that had taken his wife years ago. Work, Lila, and the constant negotiation with debt. His small workshop barely covered their meals, but he endured. Each evening he returned home to a rented room above a bait shop, the walls thin but warmed by Lila's laughter. She was the one bright certainty in a world that had otherwise eroded. And though he seldom spoke of dreams, the unspoken truth was that he worked not for himself, but to ensure she never doubted she was wanted. The morning stillness broke with the deep growl of engines. From around the bend of the marina, a sleek white yacht glided into view, its surface gleaming like bone under the early sun. It dwarfed the modest vessels tethered nearby, its presence a reminder of the worlds divided by wealth. Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag as he watched it ease toward the dock. Men in pressed uniforms scrambled across the deck, their movements clipped with urgency. Even from a distance, Daniel could sense the ripple of authority that accompanied such vessels: money, expectation, and the brittle silence of those who served it. Lila shaded her eyes and whispered, "That's not a fishing boat." Her tone carried no envy, only the frank curiosity of a child who had lived in the margins, yet observed everything. Daniel gave a short nod, already turning back to his work. He had learned long ago not to measure himself against such symbols, but his attempt to retreat into labor faltered when a dockhand approached, his expression a mixture of irritation and necessity. "Mercer," the man said, jerking his thumb toward the yacht. "They've got trouble with their engines. Nobody can get it started. They asked for help. Your name came up." Daniel felt the instinctive prickle of reluctance. Wealthy clients meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant reminders of what he lacked. Yet he couldn't afford to refuse work. He set down his rag and motioned for Lila to gather her things. Together, they walked toward the waiting yacht, the boards of the dock groaning beneath their steps. At the top of the gangway stood Isabella Veron. Her presence stilled the air around her. She wore a tailored coat the color of midnight, her dark hair pinned with effortless precision. Her eyes, green with flecks of gold, scanned the approaching mechanic with a composure that was neither warm nor dismissive, merely weighing. She had the bearing of someone used to control, yet there was an almost imperceptible tension in the way she clasped her hands. At her side lingered a boy, no more than 9, dressed neatly but with a slouch of boredom. His gaze slid past Daniel at first, only to snag on Lila's sketchbook tucked under her arm. "You're the mechanic?" Isabella's voice was low, polished by education and restraint. It was not a question but a test. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, keeping his tone even. He did not bow to deference, but neither did he challenge. His pride was tempered by pragmatism. "I can take a look." The crew exchanged doubtful glances. One muttered something about dockside grease hands, but Daniel ignored it. He stepped aboard with the slow certainty of a man who had nothing to prove except competence. Lila trailed behind, her eyes wide at the polished wood underfoot, but she stayed near the gangway, silent and observant. The engine room was a cavern of gleaming metal, its machinery humming faintly with frustrated silence. Daniel crouched, tracing wires, testing valves. The smell of salt and fuel mingled thick in the air. Time stretched, each sound magnified. The click of his wrench, the scrape of a shoe on the deck above, the faint rustle as Lila shifted on her heels. She said nothing, but once, when his brow furrowed, she remarked under her breath, "Corrosion, maybe, like Mr. Keller's sloop." Her father didn't answer, yet the corner of his mouth twitched. He had heard her, and her quiet knowledge was proof she had been listening all these years. Ethan edged closer, curiosity piqued. He watched Daniel's hands, then glanced at Lila. "How do you know that?" he asked her in a whisper. She shrugged, not looking up from her notebook. "I just listen. Dad fixes things. I remember." The simplicity of her answer unsettled him. No one in his world remembered small lessons. Staff were paid to manage, not to teach. The thought lingered, strange and magnetic. Minutes later, Daniel tightened the final bolt and turned the ignition. With a guttural roar, the yacht's engine surged to life, its vibrations shivering through the hull. Relief rippled across the crew, though some masked it with scornful silence. Isabella exhaled softly, the smallest crack in her composure, and for a moment her gaze lingered on Daniel as though seeing him more clearly. Not just a man of grease and worn flannel, but someone steady, unyielding in a world built on pretense. Lila's face lit with quiet pride, though she said nothing. Ethan stared openly, his mouth parted in wonder. The image of the mechanic, his daughter at his side, lodged itself in his young mind like a seed taking root. Daniel gathered his tools with practiced efficiency, prepared to slip away without ceremony. Work was work, nothing more. Yet as he stepped back toward the gangway, Isabella spoke. "Mr. Mercer." Her tone was formal, yet softer than before. "Thank you. That will be all." But her eyes followed him longer than her words allowed. The yacht's engine throbbed behind them, steady and sure, as Daniel and Lila walked back down the dock. The sun had risen higher, painting the water in sharp brilliance. To any passerby, it might have seemed like an ordinary morning, another repair completed, another coin earned. But something had shifted in the silence that trailed them. A boy had seen a father's quiet strength, and a woman had glimpsed more than she intended. Threads invisible yet undeniable had begun to weave, though none of them yet knew the pattern they would form. Daniel squeezed Lila's hand as they reached the boards of the old dock. She smiled up at him, blue eyes bright against the salt wind, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that the day had left behind more than just work. It had left a question unspoken, and questions, he knew, had a way of returning when least expected. The invitation came quietly, almost as an afterthought. Isabella had thanked Daniel for repairing the yacht, her voice measured, her eyes steady. Yet when he turned to leave with Lila at his side, she paused. "You should stay," she said, the words carrying the faintest hesitation, as though unused to extending hospitality beyond her circle. "At least for a meal. It's the least I can offer." Daniel stiffened, his instinct urging retreat. He had never belonged on vessels like hers, nor at tables lined with silver and crystal. His pride stirred, ready to decline. But then he caught Lila's gaze, her small, hopeful expression, the way her fingers tightened around her notebook as if imagining a moment free of worry. Hunger was a quiet companion in their lives. He swallowed the words of refusal and nodded once. They followed a steward through polished corridors, the air scented faintly of lemon and salt. Lila walked carefully, her boots clicking on the gleaming floors, her wide eyes taking in chandeliers that trembled faintly with the yacht's rhythm. She held close to her father, but curiosity glimmered in her every glance. Daniel kept his shoulders square, though every detail whispered of distance. The shine of brass fittings, the soft carpets underfoot, the sheer abundance of a world he would never claim. In the dining room, a table stretched beneath a sweep of glass that revealed the harbor beyond. Sunlight fractured across the water, spilling into the room like liquid silver. Isabella sat at the head, poised, her son at her right. Daniel and Lila were guided to the left, the space around them filled with silence that felt almost ceremonial. Plates arrived swiftly, delicate fish, bread still warm, fruit arranged in careful arcs. Daniel's fork felt foreign in his grip, his hands accustomed to wrenches and rope, not polished silver. He ate slowly, measuring each movement. Lila, though, adapted with ease. She held her fork clumsily, but spoke softly about the model ship displayed in a glass case nearby. "That's a brigantine," she said to no one in particular, her voice steady. 2 masts, square-rigged on the foremast. Ethan turned his head, surprise flickering across his features. "How do you know that?" Lila's cheeks pinkened, but she lifted her chin. "I just remember things. Dad tells me sometimes." The boy leaned closer, his curiosity genuine. "What else do you know?" She glanced at Daniel for permission. He gave the smallest nod, his expression unreadable. So she continued, listing names of knots she had heard him repeat: bowline, half-hitch, clove-hitch. Her voice was quiet, but each word carried the certainty of memory. Ethan listened as though hearing secrets. No one in his life ever explained such things. Knowledge was delivered by tutors or manuals, never by hands stained with grease and years of labor. The intimacy of it unsettled him in a way he could not name. Isabella watched, her gaze shifting between the children. She had expected awkward silence, perhaps even disdain. Instead, she saw her son's face soften with an interest she rarely witnessed. She looked at Lila, then at Daniel, noticing the way his expression warmed as his daughter spoke, though he himself remained silent. A pang stirred in Isabella, sharp and unfamiliar. The conversation meandered in fragments. Ethan asked Daniel about tools. "How do you know which one to use?" Daniel answered simply, without embellishment. "You learn the sound an engine makes when it's hurting. Each tool's just an answer to a question it's asking." Ethan frowned and thought, then nodded slowly, as if tasting the weight of the idea. Lila smiled, recognizing the phrase. She had heard it whispered many times in the workshop when her father thought she wasn't listening. For a while the only sounds were the clink of cutlery and the hush of waves against the hull. Then, as dusk deepened outside, Daniel tied his napkin in a neat fold. He was ready to excuse himself when movement caught his eye. Ethan had drifted closer across his chair, his small hands resting on the edge of the table. The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the quiet. "Can you show me how to fish?" The words landed with unexpected weight. Daniel froze, his heart thudding. Fishing was not merely a pastime. It was a ritual between him and Lila, something that belonged to the fragile world they had built together. To share it was to open a door he had kept shut since his wife's death. He looked across at Isabella, searching her face. Her expression was carefully guarded, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something raw, longing, perhaps fear. She opened her mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, leaving the silence heavy between them. Daniel cleared his throat, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Fishing's not just about casting a line," he said finally. "It takes patience and listening." He didn't give an answer, not yet, but the request had already lodged itself in him, pressing against walls he had built high. Lila studied Ethan with quiet wonder. She understood more than her father realized. The boy's voice had carried something deeper than curiosity. It had carried loneliness. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "He really wants to." Ethan looked at her, his eyes bright in the dimming light. Isabella lowered her gaze, her hands tightening in her lap. She could feel her son slipping toward something she had not been able to give him, and it unsettled her more than she would admit. The steward cleared the plates, and the spell of the moment shifted. But the question lingered, unspoken yet alive, threading itself between them like a knot neither time nor silence could untie. When Daniel rose to leave, Isabella inclined her head politely, her mask firmly in place once more. Yet as he guided Lila down the corridor, Ethan leaned close to his mother and whispered again, softer this time, "Please." She did not answer, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached to steady her glass. Outside, the night had fallen fully. The harbor lights shimmered across the water, casting long trails like stars pulled low. Daniel and Lila walked back along the dock, their footsteps echoing. Lila clutched her notebook to her chest, her eyes wide with thoughts she did not speak. Daniel's face was unreadable, but inside he carried the echo of a boy's plea and the image of a woman whose silence had revealed more than words ever could. Behind them, aboard the yacht, Isabella stood at the window, her silhouette framed against the dark. Ethan leaned beside her, his small form pressed to the glass, watching Daniel and Lila vanish into the night. His whisper clung to the air, a fragile request that refused to fade. "Teach me fishing." And in the stillness that followed, Isabella realized that something in her life had shifted, not loudly, not with spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability of tide against stone. Daniel carried the boy's request with him like a stone in his pocket, weighty, impossible to ignore. Each time he turned it over in his mind, he felt a sharp edge of longing that was not his own, but had pressed into him all the same. He had told himself that wealth and want existed in separate worlds, but Ethan's whisper had cracked that certainty. The next morning dawned gray, the harbor veiled in mist. Daniel stood at his workshop, oil staining his palms, while Lila sketched silently at the window. Her eyes strayed often to her father, sensing the storm that brewed within him. At last she spoke, her voice steady though soft. He really meant it. About fishing. Daniel paused, rag in hand, and met her gaze. There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet truth. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to want something simple yet vital. He sighed, folding the rag with slow precision. Wanting doesn't mean it's possible. But later, as the tide turned, he found himself at the yacht once more. Isabella was waiting, her posture impeccable, though her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. She regarded him with careful restraint. "My son has not stopped speaking of you," she admitted, the words edged with both gratitude and warning. "But I must ask that you tread carefully. He is easily attached." Daniel nodded, understanding more than he wished. "I don't make promises I can't keep." His voice was low, carrying the weight of a man who had broken under the burden of loss and would not risk another fracture. It was Ethan himself who settled the matter. The boy appeared at the rail, his eyes wide with a plea he could not disguise. "Will you show me?" he asked, hands gripping the polished wood. "Just once." Lila looked up at her father, her expression open, almost urging. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow, at dawn." And so it was that the four of them gathered in Daniel's battered fishing boat as the morning tide breathed against the pilings. Mist curled above the water, muffling the world into intimacy. Daniel sat at the oars, his movements sure and unhurried. Ethan perched at the bow, excitement trembling through him, while Lila sat beside him, legs swinging, her notebook tucked in her lap. Isabella, reluctant at first, had followed, her coat buttoned tight, her posture stiff against the wooden bench. The water accepted them with silence. Daniel baited the first hook, his hand steady as he demonstrated. "You don't force it," he explained, his voice carrying softly over the stillness. "The fish know when you're impatient." He passed the rod to Ethan, guiding his grip. The boy fumbled, nearly dropping it, but Daniel's hand closed over his, steadying. "Easy," he murmured. "Let the line carry its own weight." Lila leaned forward, her voice matter-of-fact. "Keep it higher, Ethan. Dad says the fish can feel when the line drags." Ethan adjusted quickly, pride glowing in his face. He looked at her as though she had revealed a secret map. "Like this." She nodded. "Exactly." Daniel watched them, a strange warmth flickering in his chest. His daughter had never needed to cast a line herself to understand its rhythm. She had learned through years of watching, absorbing, and now she passed it on, her small voice bridging a gap he hadn't believed could be crossed. Hours drifted in slow, patient silence. The mist thinned, sunlight bleeding across the water in pale gold. When at last Ethan felt a sharp tug on the line, his gasp echoed in the stillness. Daniel leaned forward, guiding him, murmuring encouragement. The rod bent, the line quivered, and with a final pull the boy lifted small fish into the boat. His laughter burst free, bright and unrestrained, startling in its purity. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining with something unguarded. She had not seen her son like this in years, not since he was very small, before her life had been consumed by obligations, appearances, and griefs she had buried beneath polished surfaces. She turned her face slightly away, but not before Daniel noticed the shimmer in her gaze. On the return to shore, silence settled heavy again, though it was not empty. Ethan sat clutching the small fish with awe, while Lila hummed softly under her breath. Daniel rowed with steady strokes, his shoulders moving in rhythm, each pull of the oars grounding him against thoughts he could not fully name. Isabella sat opposite, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the water, but her mind elsewhere. It was later, when the children had drifted off in exhaustion, that the tension found voice. Daniel stood by the dock, coiling rope, when Isabella approached. Her voice was calm, though her words struck with precision. "You've given him something I could not, and for that I thank you. But you must understand, your presence complicates things. People will talk. They always do. My world does not forgive intrusions." Daniel straightened, rope still in his hands, his jaw tight. "I didn't ask for your world," he said evenly. "I only answered a boy's request." Her composure faltered, just for an instant. "And what if he asks for more?" Her voice softened, nearly breaking. "What if he wants what you cannot stay to give?" The silence that followed was sharp. Daniel looked away, the ache of her words pressing into old scars. He thought of Lila, of the promises he had managed to keep only by narrowing his life to survival. He had nothing more to give. And yet, the image of Ethan's face, when the fish broke the surface, haunted him. That night, Isabella found her son asleep with Lila's toy sailboat clasped against his chest. The wooden hull was chipped, the mast uneven, yet he held it as though it were treasure. She sat beside him, her hand trembling as she brushed hair from his brow. Tears slipped free, silent, unbidden. She had given him every luxury, but not this, the sense of being seen, taught, cherished. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in his workshop, staring at the box of letters he never opened. His late wife's handwriting curled across envelopes, fragile yet unyielding. He placed his hand over them, closing his eyes. He had vowed not to open himself again, not to risk his daughter's fragile safety on the shifting ground of other lives. But Ethan's whisper echoed in his mind, quiet and insistent. "Teach me fishing." Lila stirred from her corner, where she had been sketching. "You'll go back," she said, not asking but declaring. Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't know if I should." She looked at him, her blue eyes steady. "You always said anyone who wants to learn deserves a chance." The room fell into silence, heavy with memory and possibility. Daniel rubbed at the scar above his brow, weary from battles both past and present. He could not deny the truth in her words. And so, against the warnings of pride and fear alike, he admitted to himself that walking away was no longer an option. When he finally blew out the lantern, the harbor lay quiet beyond the window, stars scattering across the dark. But beneath the stillness, something had shifted, like a knot pulled tighter, binding lives that had once drifted apart. Isabella came to him the next afternoon, not on the yacht surrounded by glass and steel, but at the small workshop tucked along the harbor's edge. She stepped through the doorway with a kind of hesitation that looked foreign on her, her coat brushing the sawdust scattered on the floor. Daniel glanced up from the bench where he had been oiling a reel, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the shelves sagged with years of labor, ropes coiled neatly, jars of bolts, and on the far counter, a wooden box of letters left unopened for too long. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, murmuring the names of boat parts she traced from a faded chart. She looked up, surprised by the visitor, then lowered her gaze respectfully. Isabella took in the space. Cluttered, humble, yet alive with use. The walls carried the scent of salt and oil. The windows clouded with grime. But there was warmth here, the kind that had nothing to do with wealth. Her gaze lingered on the letters for a heartbeat too long, sensing the weight of what they meant before shifting back to Daniel. "I needed to see where you belong," she said quietly. Daniel wiped his hands, waiting. His silence pressed her to continue. "My son, he has not been this alive in years. He wakes speaking of knots, of reels, of the fish he swears will be larger next time. And I," she faltered, her control slipping, "I fear I will fail him again. I don't know how to give him what he needs. Not the way you and your daughter do so effortlessly." Lila's pencil stilled, though she did not raise her head. Daniel's voice, when it came, was steady low. "It isn't effortless. It's just showing up, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." Isabella's eyes shimmered, though she blinked the tears away. "That's what terrifies me. If I open myself to this, to you, what happens when it's taken away?" Daniel set the reel aside, folding his arms as if bracing against old wounds. "It will hurt," he admitted. "It always does. But shutting yourself off doesn't spare you. It only starves what's still alive." The silence that followed was deep, filled with the sound of gulls beyond the window and Lila's soft breath. Isabella lowered her gaze, nodding once. She had come not for answers, but for truth. And though his words were plain, they carried the gravity she needed to hear. The next morning, Ethan begged for another trip. This time Isabella did not remain on the dock. She climbed into the old boat with them, the hem of her coat catching on a splintered board. The vessel rocked gently as Daniel pushed them from the pier, or as cutting through the water with practiced rhythm. Mist clung to the harbor, thinning as sunlight spread across the bay. The children sat side by side at the bow, Ethan clutching the rod with determination, Lila whispering quiet guidance. "Hold it higher. Wait for the pull." Her confidence steadied him, her voice bridging what Daniel's rough patience could not always reach. Daniel rowed in silence, his gaze flicking between them, while Isabella sat opposite, her hands folded in her lap. She looked less like an heiress here, more like a woman caught between fear and wonder. Hours passed in gentle cadence. Ethan laughed when the line jerked too soon, groaned when it came up empty, cheered when at last another fish broke the surface. Lila clapped, proud as if it were her own victory. Isabella laughed too, the sound unguarded, startling herself with its ease. Daniel allowed himself the smallest smile, rowing them back toward shore with a heart that felt both heavy and light. On the dock, the children tumbled ahead, eager to boast of their catch. Isabella lingered near the boat, her gaze fixed on Daniel as he coiled the rope with deliberate care. For a moment neither spoke. The air between them carried the weight of all that had not been said. "You've changed him," she said finally. Daniel shook his head. He only needed someone to listen. "You can do that." Her eyes softened, searching his face. "And you? What do you need, Mr. Mercer?" The question caught him unprepared. He looked at her, at the woman whose world could crush his with a glance, yet who now stood with vulnerability laid bare. His answer came slowly. "I need to believe it's not too late. For any of us." The distance closed not with words, but with a gesture. She reached for his arm as he brushed rain from his sleeve, her hand lingering longer than necessity allowed. He did not pull away. The touch was slight, but it carried more weight than 1,000 declarations. That evening, lanterns glowed along the harbor, their reflections stretching across the dark water. The children dozed near the pier, Ethan's head resting on Lila's shoulder. Daniel tied the boat with knots practiced and sure, his movements steady under the flicker of light. Isabella stood beside him, her presence no longer marked by formality, but by quiet companionship. Ethan stirred in half-sleep, his voice slurred yet clear. "I wish this was every day." Lila squeezed his hand, whispering back, "Maybe it can be." Isabella met Daniel's gaze across their children's heads. Neither spoke, but in the silence there was recognition, a fragile promise, not yet named but already alive. Daniel tightened the last knot, the rope firm beneath his hand. For years he had lived as though survival was the only measure of worth. But now, as the lantern light bathed the harbor and the children breathed softly beside them, he felt something stir that had long been dormant. He did not feel like a man looking in from the outside. He felt, for the first time since loss had hollowed him, that home had found him. And in that stillness, amid the salt and the dark, a second chance quietly took root. Lantern light shimmered across the harbor as Daniel tied the final knot, no longer an outsider, but a man who had found home. If this story moved you, subscribe and share. These moments are worth remembering.